Welcome to everyone who has joined us. There probably will be more people that will join us along the way, I'm sure. We had over 100 people registered for this webinar, but as always, we know that a lot of people probably can't make it. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Dale McKinley. I'm Research and Education Officer with the International Labor Research and Information Group, Ilrig, which is hosting this webinar. And we have a great lineup today. I'm going to be handing over to the moderator, my colleague at Ilrig, Mzee Mgeni, to introduce the speakers and then to start the webinar. Over to you, Comrade Mzee.
Okay, thanks, Comrade Dave. Am I audible?
Yes, you're fine.
Hello? Okay, thanks, Comrade Dave. Thanks, everybody, for attending. As I said, my name is Mzee Mgeni from Ilrig. In my panel, I've got Sandra Fanikar, who works for Public Service International, who's going to speak more on the roots and background to the electricity crisis. She is a seasoned political activist, and on the other hand, we've got here Comrade Lucien van der Walt. Lucien van der Walt is in the sociology department at Rhodes University. He is the director of Neil Ackett Labor Studies Unit and affiliated with the VETS History Workshop. He has long been involved in workers and union education. He's published a number of books. The one his books include Anarchism and Syndicalism in the Colonial and Post-Colonial World, as 1880 to 1940. He has also edited with Steve Hitch and on labor struggles in Southern Africa, and also published in 1919 to 1939 on New Perspective on the ICU. And just an apology, Comrade Sin Sweeney probably will be joining, is one of our panelists, will be joining along as we go along. So I'll start with Comrade Sandra to give us a background and root causes of the South African electricity crisis. Over to you, Comrade Sandra.
Thanks very much, Mzee, and thanks very much for inviting me to be part of this workshop. I just want to get my slideshow started. So can you see, can you see my screen all right, my slideshow?
Yep, no problem.
Okay, great. So as Mzee said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of background to the history or to the history of the problem that we're facing. I mean, it's a huge problem and it doesn't come out of nowhere, and it doesn't have a short history as either. So, and I think that's really, really important to remember, that this is not just a problem that stems from sort of, you know, corruption of the last 10, 20 years. This is a deep-rooted problem that has its roots in neoliberal policies that were adopted decades ago. So I just wanted to make the point that I think it's important to remember that we need to look back to understand the origins of the problems we currently face. But it's not enough to also to look back, because, you know, then we can get sort of paralyzed and say, oh, well, you know, there's where the problem is. What do we do now? We also have to understand the current context, and we have to understand why it becomes difficult in the current context to actually solve the problems and deal with the problems of the past. And I think I'll come to this at the end, but I think part of the reason why we're finding it so difficult to, or the government is finding it so difficult to grapple with the problem that is facing us now, is because they are dealing with exactly the same policy instruments that started this whole problem in the first place. And those policy instruments are the policy instruments of neoliberalism. And I think because of that broad neoliberal approach to the energy sector, nothing's going to be solved until that is fundamentally dealt with. So if we look back to ESKOM in the very early days, it's important to remember that ESKOM started, it was a kind of a bringing together of a number of different electricity plants, but it came together, its fundamental purpose was to serve the needs of the mineral energy complex. So to serve the needs of the growing mining industry that was growing up in the north, largely in the north of the country. That energy complex, minerals energy complex, depends on cheap coal, which we have because we have all the coal mines, cheap labor, which we know the apartheid system of migrant labor, pass laws, etc., provided that cheap labor, and cheap electricity. And it was creating ESKOM in the early days as a public entity, not subject to private industry competition. It was a public energy utility, and it was able to provide the cheap electricity that was so essential to the development of the minerals energy complex. So just to talk briefly, about ESKOM as a public entity when it started, it meant it didn't pay tax. And it didn't have to operate at a profit. So it really operated as a public utility. It used revenue raised from the sale of electricity to finance its costs and to finance new build programs. And it was able to kind of generate cheap electricity to meet the needs of, obviously, the white monopoly population and capitalism at that time. This map just shows, just to remind ourselves of where that the development of the coal mines and the development of the generating plants that go with the coal mines were very much concentrated up in the north around where coal is found and mined. And that's where the sort of monopoly coal companies developed and grew. Then if we talk about the 1970s and demand for electricity is growing, and ESKOM borrows money to fund a new build program. So, in many ways, history repeating itself, demand grows, it recognizes the need for a new build program, it borrows money to do that. But at the same time, that new build program was partly funded through something called the Capital Development Fund, which was a fund where surplus income was channeled so that there would be a source of funding for new build programs. But it was at about this time, the late 1970s, 1980s, that neoliberalism globally was developing, and South Africa was coming under the influence of neoliberalism and neoliberal policies. And pressure started being, there was a lot of pressure on ESKOM for demand for electricity, prices started rising. There was a big outcry because they had load shedding at that time in the 80s. And to deal with those pressures, ESKOM, that was facing ESKOM, the government established the de Villiers Commission in 1983. And it was as a result of this de Villiers Commission and the outcome of this de Villiers Commission that the process of the corporatization of ESKOM started. And it is that sort of point, where that de Villiers Commission came out with the recommendation for the corporatization of ESKOM, that kind of a lot of the problems that we see today originate. So private capital, for instance, was brought into a reconstituted electricity council. So for the first time, private capital had a kind of a seat in the decision-making body of ESKOM. Very importantly, to understand where we are now, ESKOM was commercialized. So it had to now operate on the basis of profit making. So it was It had to show, you know, a solid financial gain. It had to start paying taxes, etc., paying dividends and so on. So it had to operate on a commercial basis, and that commercial basis kind of overtook any sense of a public ethos of ESKOM as a public entity. And then it also established a national tariff. So if we look at this diagram that I've put here, you'll see that in 1994, when the first national democratic elections happened, by that time, electricity was still very cheap. There was a surplus of electricity being generated. And partly because of that, ESKOM entered into special pricing agreements with the aluminium and ferrochrome smelter companies, which gave them access to incredibly cheap electricity. And those agreements have come back to haunt, you know, ESKOM years later. And ESKOM was also accessing coal through long-term supply contracts at that stage. Then in 1998 saw the release of the white paper on energy policy. And this, remember, this was a white paper that was developed at a time of GEAR, at a time of the ANC government implementing neoliberal economic policies. So now there was a move towards privatizing state-owned entities. And that white paper in 1998 raised the possibility of unbundling. And it saw 30% of generation coming from the private sector in the future. It also kind of argued that, you know, the best way forward for the electricity system was competition, that if you had competition, the system would be more efficient, more effective. Those are arguments that we know the privateers have been putting forward for decades. And we know that they've been debunked for decades, that private companies being involved in the provision of public services is not what promotes efficiency and the delivery of quality public services. And then that white paper also introduced the idea of independent power producers. So in other words, ESKOM would no longer be the only generator of electricity. You would now have independent power producers who would then sell their electricity to ESKOM, who would then transmit it and distribute it. And it was also at this time that ESKOM's tax-exempt status was repealed. So from 1998, it has to start paying tax. And this whole process that started right there with the De Villiers Commission culminates in 2001 with the ESKOM Conversion Act, where ESKOM is converted from a statutory body to a company. So it's no longer a kind of a state entity in law. It's now a company under the Companies Act and must act like a company. It's required to pay tax and dividends, and stakeholders, trade unions, community organizations, etc., are removed from the reconstituted board of directors. Now, at the same time that all of this was happening in terms of the kind of structural approach to ESKOM and how ESKOM should be structured and how ownership and control should be exercised, ESKOM post-1994 was obviously also facing enormous pressure to roll out electricity to those who had not had access to electricity under apartheid. And it started a massive electrification program and a very successful electrification program. So that between 1994 and 2000, it added 2.4 million households to the grid. But from 1997, that program starts to slow down. So it's not coincidental that that program is starting to slow down just about at the time that that white paper is being produced, which starts talking about unbundling, which, you know, many people understand as a precursor to privatization of ESKOM. So you can see that while ESKOM was being driven by sort of a more social democratic or sort of social welfare imperative to make sure that more people had access to electricity, that program was overwhelmed by the neoliberal context that the government was operating in. So as much as it had the massive electrification program, it also had a free basic electricity program from 2003. But we know that this has been a difficult and bureaucratic process, that it's difficult for households to access, it was and is difficult for households to access the free basic electricity, and that it's too little, it's much, much too little to meet people's basic needs. And only 21% of 10.1 million indigent households actually received the free basic electricity in the 2019 and 2020 financial year. And as much as you had the free basic electricity policy, you also had ESKOM and the government implementing cost recovery policies. And it's those cost recovery policies which make it so difficult for people who are being added to the grid to actually be able to afford the electricity, that, you know, the electricity lines are being laid to their house and switches are being put on in their house, but they can't actually use electricity because of the tariffs and the cost recovery policies that are being implemented. So all of this is contributing to ongoing high levels of energy poverty in the country. So you know, on the one hand, you've got the kind of neoliberal policies being implemented in relation to how ESKOM is structured, ownership, control, the kind of attempt to do some more social welfare policies. And by sort of the mid 2000s, ESKOM starts facing more and more of a financial crunch. It's got a limited income because there are, you know, a limited number of people who can actually afford to pay electricity. It's paying taxes and dividends. The Capital Development Fund, which it had used in the past to fund new build, is being discontinued. And in this context, a 2001 cabinet meeting decides that there will be no new build program implemented by the government. And it just makes this decision not because it didn't think that there was a need for electricity. There was a clear need for increased build program because there was a problem with a low supply of electricity, but because it actually planned to part of the privatization process. So it wanted to privatize generation. And if it wanted to privatize generation, why invest itself in new generation? So that was kind of, you know, the thinking behind that 2001 cabinet meeting. And the result has kind of caught up with us now. Well, it caught up with us sort of in the early sort of 2008 or so, where we no longer had enough supply to meet the demand. At the same time that it decided that there would be no new build program and that it was heading towards privatization, a whole new restructuring process was approved. And at that time, there was, in the early 2000s, there was going to be a kind of a restructuring of ESKOM into an ESKOM holding company and then regional electricity distributors. This was never put into effect. It was met with a lot of opposition from the trade unions. But what was kind of ultimately followed through and is currently being, what was followed through at the time was the development of independent business units for transmission, generation, and distribution. So already then, ESKOM was being broken into these independent business units. And we've seen the sort of culmination of that with the unbundling process that has been happening and the setting up of a separate transmission company that happened last year or the year, I think it was last year or the year before. So the first load shedding starts in 2008. You know, there's just a huge crunch, lack of supply, problem of no new build. low demand because of the price. And all of these, well, no, there wasn't low demand at that stage. There was supply problems. And they tried to introduce new build through Medupi and Kusile, but those took a very long time, much longer to come online than expected, delayed building, massive cost overruns, design problems, corruption, everything. And so Medupi and Kusile couldn't contribute to the supply issues for many, many years. And they've been a source of many of the problems that we are currently facing today, both in relation to poor design and therefore units keep breaking down, but also to sort of the source of a lot of the corruption that is still facing ESKOM today. But I think one of the biggest problems facing ESKOM that has really contributed to the ongoing crisis and the ongoing load shedding is the lack of maintenance that was carried out both at an ESKOM level, but also at a local government level. So at that crucial point in ESKOM and local government's history, where both ESKOM and local government should have been putting more money into maintenance, they weren't doing it on ESKOM's side because there was the plan to privatize, and on local government's side because there was the plan to move local government assets up into regional distribution companies, which ultimately fell through, but it left a kind of a big backlog of maintenance that was never done. So we're now sitting with an aging fleet, and many of the midlife enhancements that should have taken place haven't been done, or plants have reached their kind of second sell-by date, and that is the problem that we're sitting with, the constant breakdowns, etc. Obviously, on top of that, as I've said, there was the state capture, there was the deep-rooted corruption that started developing that really kind of took a strong hold on ESKOM and what was happening at ESKOM at that time. So what the situation today with ESKOM, we've got on the one hand financial mismanagement, debt, huge debt, that ESKOM is in, but it's also owed a huge debt by municipalities and institutions. It's unable to properly maintain its plants, ongoing load shedding. I mean, not a day in 2022 that we haven't had load shedding. And at the same time, we've now got the functional separation of the generation, transmission, and distribution. We've got the transmission has been set up as a separate company. Municipalities can now procure their own generation capacity. There's been the introduction of the Just Energy Transition Partnership. All of these things. So it sounds great for municipalities to be able to generate their own electricity, and it would be if municipalities were doing it. But what's happening is that municipalities are simply contracting independent power producers to generate electricity and then sell it onto the municipality. So what we're seeing is the deep entrenchment of the private sector in the energy system, in the electricity sector. The private sector is basically doing most of the renewable energy, generating most of the renewable energy, both through the kind of renewable energy independent power producers program, also through things like embedded generation. The Just Energy Transition Partnership that was announced at COP26 in 2021, and kind of promised billions of rands to assist ESKOM to transition to renewables, in fact, is mostly being provided on the basis of loans rather than grants. So it increases the debt facing ESKOM. So it kind of deepens and carries on the debt because it now has to pay back that money. But it's also very much about bringing in private providers of electricity, private providers of renewable energy, who sell to ESKOM, who sell to municipalities, etc. So it's become a very open market, private market for electricity in South Africa. And that is being seen as the way out of the crisis rather than an understanding that, in fact, we need to be strengthening ESKOM as a public utility, renationalizing ESKOM, decorporatizing it, taking away its corporate status, renationalizing ESKOM, so that it can run as a viable public entity in the public interest, on the basis of generating, moving towards renewable energy as the main source of electricity ultimately. And I know Sean is going to talk more about that and about why it is so important for the future of electricity in South Africa, for this to be done for electricity to be a public good, rather than this kind of laissez-faire, privatized situation that is increasingly developing now as this load shedding crisis deepens and carries on. So just to conclude, to come back to my first slide, where I said that we need to understand the current context as much as we need to understand the history of how we came here. And I think the current context, which is the result of what's been happening since the 1980s, is that ESKOM is operating in a context of neoliberalism, a drive towards privatization of the electricity sector, a failure over the decades by government to protect public energy as a public good so that it can meet the needs of people, pervasive, deep-rooted corruption and mismanagement. So I think that's the challenge that we're facing now, that in this current context, the only way to solve this problem of electricity is to strengthen electricity as a public good. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sandra, for that very, very informative and useful history, reminding us of where the problems, both structurally and relationally, monetarily, and otherwise ideologically as well, the crisis comes from. It's very, very important for us, I think everybody, given all of the noise that is around the ESKOM crisis, and quite a lot of the myths and misinformation that is being spread to support, increased privatization and giving everything just over to the private sector as if that's going to solve everything, that we remind ourselves of how and why it's important to defend the public. And in that spirit, our next speaker, Dr. Lucian van der Walt, is going to talk specifically to that issue about the case for public ownership and what forms that public ownership takes. Because oftentimes when progressives talk about public ownership, people laugh and go, oh yeah, well, look at the state of things now. What are you talking about? It's the worst thing that could happen. So this is a debate and a discussion that is fundamentally important for anyone across, not just in South Africa, but across the world, who wants to defend public services and public spaces, and to have so the distribution, not just of energy, but of other basic services can be equal and just. It's in that spirit I'm going to hand over to Lucian. Lucian, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dale. I don't have a great presentation set of slides like Sandra, who I think did a fantastic job in filling a lot of the background and reminding us that it's important not always to see problems in the short term, or as we tend to do in South Africa, to see everything as a result of specific individuals. I think that's a very crippling problem in a lot of South African politics, that it's really about superheroes and supervillains. There's good people and bad people, and the solution then becomes to swap people around. Now, as Dale said, part of what I'm going to speak to is the question of public ownership. And I want to complicate this discussion a bit. I'm going to be reading a bit from some of my notes, so I may sometimes be looking down, but I hope comrades can follow me, and if there are any issues, we can come back to them. Now, obviously, the reasons for the ESKOM crisis have been the subject of much discussion. And because this discussion of what the problem is shapes what the possible solution could be, these things get tangled up a bit. I think here it might be useful, and I'm going to come at it from building a bit on what Dale said, but maybe in a way slightly different to how this is often approached, by looking what I consider to be a few of the myths about this gigantic state corporation. I consider the first myth the argument that ESKOM has been or has ever been public property. Now, this is based on two sets of ideas which I think are problematic. One, that the state represents the public, and two, that state property is somehow public property. The reality is that ESKOM is owned by the state, and ordinary people have no real ownership or control of the state or of ESKOM itself, no more than they own or control Anglo, Lonmin, or MTN. ESKOM is controlled by government ministers and state appointees. It reports the Department of Public Enterprises and the Department of Mineral Resource and Energy. You have no real control over what those departments do, what their ministers do, what their director generals do. Its operations are governed by legal frameworks and shaped by policy frameworks from other departments as well. For example, the Department of Trade and Industry. As Sandra mentioned, it has a board of directors, but this board is appointed by the state, which is the shareholder, and in practice by the ruling ANC through its so-called cadre deployment. There's no substantive mechanism for any direct or meaningful popular intervention in its affairs. And to the extent we might think of it as state property, as the property of the people, you can simply find out by going to an ESKOM and carrying a chair out of an ESKOM office, and you'll see whether you, as a member of the public, actually own their organization or anything in it. I think it should be clear by now, after 20 years or so of load shedding, which continually escalates, that the views of the working class and poor have no real impact on the utility. As one example, and this lines up with the reforms that Sandra was speaking about, ESKOM staff were cut from 66,000 in 1984 to 30,000 in 2004. Dale speaks about misinformation. Well, here's one of the examples. Many commentators complain about ESKOM being overstaffed and so on, citing the figure of about 47,000 employees in 2018. But it's important to bear in mind that in 2018, with 47,000 jobs, ESKOM actually had 20,000 less jobs than it had in the early 1980s, with a smaller electricity grid, a smaller economy, and a smaller public that was being served by the utility. So ordinary people either rely on bodies like NERSA, the National Electricity Regulator of South Africa, for protection, court cases, although those don't go very far because ESKOM has got a range of indemnities, or protests, such as the revolts against disconnections that we saw in the 1990s and 2000s, which actually led to the introduction of free basic electricity for poorer households in 2004. I mean, it was also working class pressure that led to ESKOM initially diversifying its electricity supply to white working class areas. As Sandra mentioned, ESKOM was primarily set up to regulate, supplement, and eventually control and provide the basic electricity supply for big corporations and for government operations. Bear in mind, when we talk about big corporations in South Africa, they're not just the private sector. The state itself owns huge corporations. One of them is ESKOM, but the state has other electricity-dependent operations such as Transnet with its railway grid, such as national broadcasting, such as military facilities and manufacturing. So I think the one point I'd just like to make here is that ESKOM is fundamentally controlled by an elite of senior state officials and politicians. And this, to my mind at least, is not a change from an earlier period in which the utility was under some sort of meaningful popular control. I think it operated on a different mandate, as Sandra pointed out. It didn't have to make profit, but its fundamental mandate in the pre-1994 period, as in the post-1994 period, is not really shaped by what ordinary people want or need. So technically, yes, we could say ESKOM is public property in the sense owned by the state, but I think substantively it's not, in that ordinary people have no real meaningful ownership, control, or input into how this thing works. It's a top-down state corporation historically integrated into the apartheid capitalist system and subsequently restructured for a neoliberal era starting from the 1980s. And it's top-down precisely so that a small elite can hold the levers of power in it and direct its resources in ways that benefit that elite and its partners and its project and its allies in the private sector. And this top-down structure is also quite typical of state operations. Other state companies, big ones, small ones, and at all levels of government, whether you're dealing with a municipal bus service or you're dealing with Transnet. And this is the same basic structure we see in the private sector in firms like Anglo, Lonmin, MTN. Things are top-down, they're run by small groups, and they're often presented as owned by the shareholders or owned by the public, but there's no substantive meaning to that any more than if you have a pension policy invested by the Public Investment Corporation in Lonmin, you control Lonmin. I think the second thing, and Sandra spoke to this a bit, is it's often being framed in the working class movement right now that the main thing is to stop ESKOM being privatized. And this refers very much to ESKOM's revival and government's revival of older plans. They've been dusted off from about 20 years ago from the Mbeki gear era to allow a greater role for independent power producers, thus ending ESKOM's actual legal monopoly, to allow the sale of some ESKOM assets, to allow competition in distribution and even transmission. The thing about when we frame the issue in, I'm not speaking specifically about this panel, but in many trade unions, as we must stop ESKOM being around profit-making, is precisely what Sandra pointed out, that ESKOM has been oriented to making profits since at least 1987 with the amended ESKOM Act, the subsequent amendment in 1998, the White Paper, the 2001 ESKOM Conversion Act. So when we look at this, there's another dimension as well. Although ESKOM primarily was not unbundled for a long time and remained in state ownership, its mandate as a state corporation was to make profits. We can think of it as a state capitalist corporation. The fact it's not making a lot of profits right now doesn't really affect that. Private businesses go into debt or go bankrupt. A state business can go into debt or go bankrupt. But there's another level at which ESKOM is also very much involved in markets and privatization, in the sense that at one level, ESKOM uses its massive spend through contracting out to the private sector, what we usually call tendering, to build local capitalists and specifically black capitalists through the BEE system. And at the same time, internally, ESKOM provides a source of accumulation. In 2016, ESKOM executives earned 60 million rand. The CEO at the time was paid 4 times the salary of the state president. Salary put the CEO in the level of some of the comparable to some of that of the larger private companies. I'm talking about salaries here, not dividends as such. That same year, 2016, ESKOM, pleading poverty, had a standoff with trade unions and sought to impose a wage cut on workers through a below inflation wage offer. And bear in mind as well, this was a period against the backdrop of massive layoffs of workers. So the elites running ESKOM do not just use it for general processes of accumulation, like sponsoring the ability of mines and that to work, but they use it for very specific forms of state patronage that target specific sectors of the capitalist class. Through preferential bidding, through preferential, often inflated payment schemes to private sector companies. So I want to stress here as well, it's not that ESKOM is some sort of marginal asset. In 2018, ESKOM was the 4th largest single Africa-based profit-making corporation by turnover. It was operating in about 30 countries. We can think of it here as a sort of state-owned multinational corporation. And in terms of 2018 ranking, ESKOM by turnover was bigger than Anglo-American. Now, in a recent newspaper article, Nick Dahl and Matthew Blackman criticized Andre de Ruyter for failing to note that ESKOM had been used by the apartheid state previously for Afrikaner economic empowerment. The argument was essentially that de Ruyter said he had a white Afrikaner blind spot, that didn't allow him to see how ESKOM was being used for patronage, corruption, and BEE. And the point that Blackman and Dahl were making is this happened in the past. It happened under the National Party, was often facilitated through the Broederbond, and certainly Afrikaner economic empowerment deeply influenced the contracts that ESKOM gave out. Now, the bigger point that they're making, and I don't think they're putting it explicitly, is that even when ESKOM was not formally charged with profit-making as an entity, it was always essential to profitability for the private sector in general, as well as profitability for specific sections of the private sector, as well as high incomes for specific sections of the political elite. Now, I want to just bring this together and start to tie this to the broader question of what ownership is appropriate. One of the things is that a neat distinction that we often draw between a non-profit, pro-people state operation, public, and a pro-profit, anti-people private operation, private, actually doesn't work in practice. The division blurs too much. One way to think about this is to think about a system of state capitalist, a complex of state capitalist interventions. Now, these change over time. I think this is where Dow and Blackman get it a bit wrong. There's a difference between Simon van der Stel crooking the Dutch East India Company, Paul Kruger scamming the mines, or the Broederbond or Thabo Mbeki using ESKOM. But the bigger point is that there's a continuity in this situation. So I think often when we draw a distinction between a good period of ESKOM and a bad period, that on the basis of when it became neoliberal or not, we can often miss this bigger point. Now, it's not to say that neoliberalism isn't absolutely crucial here. Obviously, the crisis in ESKOM has to be understood against a neoliberal backdrop. ESKOM ran down its facilities, cut investments in new plant, gutted its staff, gutted maintenance, redirected wealth to small groups of wealthy and powerful people. It fell apart under multiple contradictory mandates, like demands that cut spending, on the other hand, grow the power supply, demands that it service the poor, on the other hand, preferential contracts with big companies who got electricity cheaper than poor people. It became subject to the whims of politicians, cadre deployment, patronage, and leadership instability. And for examples of the sort of astonishing mismanagement, we can look at the Medupi, Kusile, and Ngula expansions. They're 400 million over budget, they're 7 years late, and they're still not working properly. And when we add to the state capture with the Zumaites essentially hijacking the tender system for criminal looting on an unprecedented scale, you get where we are today. So I want to make a third point here. Yes, the problem is partly neoliberalism, but the problem is also partly the way the state works as such. Finally, it's partly not just a thing of the state operating in a top-down way, but of specific problems in the South African state. And I'm going to mention a few here. One, the South African state does not operate very efficiently. Sandra mentioned municipalities not looking after infrastructure, ESKOM not looking after its own property, but this is part of a broader thing in the South African state. For example, ESKOM was given different mandates from different parts of the state. These different parts did not coordinate their demands. They did not have integrated plans, and it would be on the one hand rewarded for cutting maintenance, and on the other hand chided for cutting maintenance. So there's a question here about the state in South Africa itself and its deep dysfunctions and fragmentation, which is again nothing new. Under apartheid, we had 18 parliaments, we had numerous state corporations in homelands, different state banks, segregated education system. Things are better now, but the state in South Africa is not what it thinks it is, which is some sort of developmental state. It's quite a fractured state with predatory characteristics. And we see this with the role of political party infighting, patronage, theft, a blurring between the ruling party and the state, both under the National Party, in the homelands, and now post-apartheid with the African National Congress. So maybe to put that together, the problem is neoliberalism, but neoliberalism isn't just a thing. It's shaped very much by the context in which it takes place, the specific state that exists, and the specific balance of class forces. For example, using neoliberalism to promote BEE, or using a non-profit ESKOM to promote Afrikaner enterprises in the 50s cannot be explained simply by a larger program of neoliberalism or import substitution industrialization. Running down ESKOM spending is one thing, but the inability to build a functioning power station, as at Kasuli, the inability to stay within budgets, those cannot be attributed to neoliberalism. There's something else happening. So it can be a bit difficult to work out what the difference is and what's happening here, but I think we need to bear this both in mind. Now, where to? Is there a place for public ownership? And if so, what does this mean? I think here we need to go to some first principles. What is the aim of seeking change at ESKOM? I think it's surely to see what can benefit and achieve what can benefit the working class majority. Obviously, the working class has an interest in ESKOM working well. The state of ESKOM affects jobs, it affects education, it affects safety, it affects living conditions, it affects the ability of people to run small-scale micro-enterprises, all sorts of things. It affects the transport grid, everything. So while the working class is an oppressed class, obviously it also has a vested interest, paradoxical as it may seem, in the existing system working well, to the extent that economic growth or stability leads to jobs, lower prices, decent public services. It's not simply a case of the worse, the better. I mean, paradoxically, the working class is stronger when the economy is booming, when unemployment is lower, and when people's confidence is higher because they're less frightened. Similarly, a left project is valuable to the extent, in my view, only to the extent that it helps tilt the balance of forces towards the popular masses. I think it's not a question of whether the working class is good enough for the left project, but whether the left project is good enough for the working class. So from here, I'd say we can be fairly flexible on how we approach issues tactically within specific contexts. We need to have methods that are consistent with and contribute to end goals. And I would say those end goals are fundamentally shifting power towards the working class, improving its conditions, and opening the door for the working class to fundamentally change society. Of course, we'd have to look at context, what is possible, and of course, we'd have to look at what has worked in the past and what hasn't. So for me, the issue of whether if something's done by the private sector or the state is not really an issue of principle. I think it's an issue of what works best for the working class, and I think a case can be made either way. What matters, I think, is whatever system we have in place, is that it can be directed to winning maximum gains for the working class, whether it's for ESKOM or IPPs. For me, this fundamentally means pressure from the working class, as we saw with free basic electricity, as we saw for electrification of popular areas. I think it comes down to power from below. So to the extent that we can make electricity a public good for the masses, that is really fundamentally a question of the ability of the masses to force a decommodification of electricity from below. The problem, though, that we got is that the working class movement and the working class in general is in a state of disarray. We have to factor that in, disintegration in many structures, decline of workers' control, the massive fragmentation and social decay we see under neoliberalism, high levels of criminality, basic demoralization left, right, and center. So I think there's two last points I want to make here. One is that in approaching the issue of making electricity in some sense a public good is a question of a long march in rebuilding the power of the working class. And that's a process. It requires winnable struggles. It requires concrete gains and not slogans. I think it requires quite a lot of basic work in rebuilding capacities for self-governance. Now, my second point is, in terms of a bigger picture of having some sort of meaningful, substantive working class ownership of things like the electricity supply, I think we can look at different options. It will partly depend on the power of the working class, and I think it'd have to be a case by case as well. Would it help to get some sort of organized working class representation in the governing structures of IPPs or ESKOM? We could think about that. Would it be useful if there's some sort of municipal decentralization of electricity supply to look at ways of having community and worker forums exercise some sort of expanded control over those structures. I think for me, to bring it to a close here, I think we need to rethink what public ownership is. Dale pointed to this, and I think it's an important thing. Public ownership is often conflated with state ownership, but state ownership is very rarely any meaningful form of public ownership. The question, though, is how do you make something a public good, something a non-profit good that ordinary people can access without necessarily having to pay for it? Something that is almost a right or an entitlement in society. I think that goes down to both finding ways to reorganize and, on the other hand, finding concrete institutionalized ways that the working class broadly can intervene, but without losing its autonomy. One of the problems we saw in things like ESKOM was the ability of the patronage systems in ESKOM to buy off parts of the unions, to pacify workers with wage grants, to find ways of expanding non-essential work in order to create patronage bases for particular leaders and factions, both in the ruling party, the central government, and in ESKOM itself. So to bring this to an absolute close, I think where ESKOM is a huge mess. I don't have a simple answer. I think we need to approach it from the perspective of how do we develop some sort of popular power that can bring something like ESKOM or IPPs to book, that can rebuild a popular power that can start to tilt the balance of forces. So I'll leave it there. I've had quite a long chat there, and I'd like to thank you guys for all listening to me. If there are any issues, I'm sure we can raise them in questions. And for Comrade MZ and that, I don't know if the other speaker arrived. I haven't really looked at the attendees list, but I'll just turn off my video here. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Lucian. Really, I think both of Sandra's and Lucian's presentations were not only informative, but very thought-provoking. Lucian has raised a number of, I think, crucial issues that have escaped a lot of our conversations and the debates, which, as he pointed out, and in fact, as many other sort of more radical and I think alternative commentators have pointed out, have been missed. It's almost as though, just like all of our other crises, whether it's ESKOM or general governance or local level service delivery, if we just get the right party or the right individuals in, or we just change this and get a few bad apples out, we'll be okay. The crisis goes very deep. I think that's what we're beginning to understand more and more. Not just with ESKOM, but across the board. So I'm not going to, unfortunately, my colleague MZ, who is the moderator, has lost, as a result of load shedding and a whole range of other things, has lost contact with us. He was near Stellenbosch, and so I'm just taking over for the moderation. We also have had a challenge in securing Sean Sweeney, who we've been trying to get in touch with over the last hour, our international speaker from the United States, who is going to look at some of the international experiences of remunicipalization and, turning where entities, and particularly on energy, had been privatized or commodified, and then through struggles and a whole range of other things had been republicized in many cases in different forms, which would have been a very interesting input. But unfortunately, we have not been able to get in touch with Sean, and he has not joined us. So that's fine. We are now at 5 p.m. and we have given our speakers a bit more time. So what I'm going to do now, folks, is we're just going to open up the space. And we prefer at Ilrig for people to speak live as opposed to typing their questions in the chat, even though that was an option. So I'm opening up the floor for it. All you need to do is just raise your hand. You'll see at the bottom of your facility, I'm sure everybody's familiar with these Zoom facilities now. Just raise your hand and then I will allow you to speak. You can make a comment, raise a question. I think there's quite a few things that we could probably talk about. So the floor is open. Are there any participants who would like to ask a question, like to make a comment? Please feel free. I know it's always challenge the first person to come along. I'm just going to put one out there myself to both Sandra and Lucian to start the ball rolling, which would be it's this. I think one of the key questions that and particularly those on the left and more progressive side of the fence, so to speak, face when we have these kinds of debates and we talk about public ownership, the forms of that. It's oftentimes because there's this notion that, as Lucian pointed out, it's either state or private. That's it. State ownership, private ownership. But that's clearly not the case. But it's made more complicated by the fact that when you have a large national entity, a large national service provider like ESKOM, as opposed to maybe a local water board or very local municipal kinds of services, it makes it a lot more difficult to imagine what the form of that kind of public ownership would take. And I would ask both speakers maybe to wade into that a little bit and give us a sense of what you think, given our circumstances, the scenes that you've laid out, the environment that we are in at the moment, both politically, economically, and otherwise, and as Lucian had pointed out, the weakness of working class forces at this stage, what kind of form that might take, even if we can, because we need to imagine that, even if we can't practically see it coming in the next while, we have to imagine that and advocate for it and push for that. That's how oftentimes struggle and change happens. So that would be my a question to both of you. And I don't see, we've got a shy participant list at the moment. There we are. Offense, I'm going to allow you to speak. Go ahead, ask your question or make your comment. Just unmute yourself. Yeah.
Is that good?
Go ahead, we can hear you. Yeah.
My question is just like, what does the future hold if ESKOM continues to run as a state-owned multinational corporation and it's, there's not really public access to what happens for the future now or in this meantime?
Okay. Thanks, Offensa, and thanks for that very, I think, direct but important question. In lieu of, I'll give others a little bit more chance to think maybe for your comments or questions, but I'm going to ask either Sandra and Lucian, either one of you want to start us off with responding to those two comments and questions that have been put on the table. Go ahead, Lucian.
Yeah, sure.
And go ahead and just turn on your video, if you will. Thanks.
Oh, sure, no problems. Okay, let me also take down that hand. I just want to maybe start with Offense's question. I think that's actually crucial. I think part of what I'm making an argument around is that the specific way that ESKOM operates in a given conjuncture depends not on specific policy measures, but on particular conjunctures within the state and the larger class structure. I think we can speak in the 1994 to say 2007 Polokwane rupture in the African National Congress of a bit of a quid pro quo where a Black political elite would be able to have state power and accumulate wealth primarily through using the state and through deals with big historically white business. Big historically white business would retain control over its historic assets and would be also serviced by the new state. So the new state would, on the one hand, incubate a new Black elite, but on the other hand, would also deliver to big business. And that could be directly, for example, providing electricity, whether through the private sector getting its foot in, or whether through finding ways to provide contracts, especially discounted deals and so on. Sandra spoke about some of those with the huge aluminium smelters. From 2007, I think there's a bit of a break. What you get is a reconfiguration where what I'm calling the Zumaites, and maybe that politicizes it too much, but a particular faction of the state-based Black elite does not like this arrangement anymore. It wants to find ways to accumulate without the constraints of the deal with big white business. They're not breaking with capitalism. They're not even necessarily breaking with neoliberalism, but they're very aggressively seeking ways to accumulate as quickly as possible under the name of radical economic transformation, RET. And this is, a lot of this is represented by state capture, where you essentially have massive rigged contracts to the private sector, which are then fluffed up with absurdly high bills and insanely terrible delivery to the contract. So in that first period, we could maybe think about ESKOM's neoliberal trajectory sort of working a bit, but the second, and at least being compatible with the private sector's accumulation process. But from the Zuma period, we get a complete rupture where the enrichment of that elite in the state isn't compatible with and in a synergy with the accumulation by the big private sector elite. It's actually in contradiction. So you literally have ESKOM unable to help mines stay open, unable to help car factories stay open. You literally have universities closed. You literally have an inability to function. I think the question would be, are we going back to something more like the 1994 deal? Is this part of what the Ramaphosa New Dawn post-Zuma period is? Will they be able to find a new deal in the elite, which can maybe lead to ESKOM functioning better and the economy recovering? Can they do that? In both cases, the power of the working class is a crucial variable, but in 1990s, 2000s, the working class was incredibly powerful and was able to block key neoliberal reforms, for example, cost recovery, prepaid meters, and win free basic electricity. It's not in that position now. So I think the odds now is if we have a recovery, it's not going to be in some sort of pro-poor, pro-working class direction, except in as much if there is a recovery, there are more jobs, the lights stay on more, things like that work better. So I think there may be a way out, but fortunately at the moment, it's probably not going to be driven by the working class. Probably not going to be driven by the working class. We'll probably get in probably the best case scenario, I suppose, is a new elite pact, but we may not get that. We may not get that. In terms of what state and public ownership could mean, Dale, I think I'm trying not to necessarily provide big solutions, because I think the problems of ESKOM can be so overwhelming, and so much of the demoralization of the left, in my view, is we keep promoting things that don't seem feasible and they don't seem to work. You know, you can get a lot of people in unions who say, well, you know, what do you think about ESKOM being privatized? And a lot of people just tell you, that'll be great if I get power. So I think in this situation, I'm more in favor of small, winnable, local victories. I'm in favor of ways that we could think of decentralizing governance in ESKOM. If that means ESKOM being fragmented and more of the stuff being at municipal level, I think that could be useful. I think fundamentally the issue is to build some sort of meaningful working class capacity to discipline and hopefully start to influence what ESKOM does, bearing in mind that the working class is not in control of things. Maybe that's a bit of a cop-out, but let me stop there. I'm sure other people want to speak.
Thanks. Sandra, I'm going to give you an opportunity now to respond. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the other sort of factor that needs to be, you know, we've been talking about the problems and the crisis of ESKOM. I think the other issue that we haven't been talking about that does impact on both these questions is the crisis of climate change and the need to transition. So, you know, so it's not just a crisis that we're facing in South Africa of ESKOM as a state utility kind of more or less imploding and not able to deliver the electricity that's needed. It's also that it's facing, the country is, you know, globally we're facing a crisis of climate change, which necessitates a shift towards renewable energy. And I think the problem is that if we, you know, if we don't strengthen if we don't find a way ultimately to strengthen ESKOM as a public utility, and have, so ultimately, I think that the solution has to be that ESKOM takes on renewable energy, that ESKOM leads the shift from coal to renewable energy. And it is only in that way that the transition away from coal is going to happen effectively, with enough ambition and actually fast enough than it would with the private sector. That the lights are going to sort of stay on. I think that the problem with not keeping ESKOM as a national utility, which is responsible for electricity, obviously renewable energy lends itself to a more decentralized and more diffuse generation situation, because you can do it through embedded generation on rooftops, etc. But in my mind, you run the risk of, we have such inequality, such poverty in South Africa, that unless you are in, unless there's some national body or potentially local government, fundamentally what you need is a partnership between ESKOM and local government, a kind of a public partnership situation where ESKOM, local government, potentially cooperatives and other community organizations, not the sort of non-profit sector, are working together in a way that actually increases access to electricity, with ESKOM playing a key role in ensuring that renewable energy is rolled out and that access is increased. So unless that kind of, so to come to the second question, I mean, I think unlike in the past where ESKOM acted as a national utility because coal generation was kind of a very centralized process that happened, and huge amounts of electricity were generated and then kind of transmitted to the rest of the country. Now you can have it being generated all over the country effectively. But I think in that context, you need a kind of a strong ESKOM and then strong local government partnering with community organizations or whatever, but working together in a coherent national plan in order to ensure that everybody has access to electricity. That some parts of South Africa where maybe the wind's not blowing, or some parts of South Africa, where there's high levels of poverty, are not, and they don't have access to community, to PV panels or whatever, that there is a kind of a national perspective on how to ensure access for all in a kind of a public partnership situation. So I'll leave it at that. Thank
you. Thanks, Sandra. I see that we have two more hands now. Farhan, you had your hand up and then you took it down. So hold on a second. There you go. Okay, go ahead, Farhan.
Thanks, Comrade Sari. I wasn't sure if I should speak because Comrade Sandra just answered my question a bit, but I think maybe I'll just read it, and Comrade Lucian, if you have something to add, that would be very helpful. I just wanted to say thank you so much for this brilliant presentation for both of you, and thank you for Ilrig for hosting this. I always find these discussions so important. So I can't agree more with the idea that we need to rebuild popular power to tilt the balance of forces, and that whatever our goals are, this can only be gained with sort of real working class power and rebuilding in many ways of our working class organizations. The Climate Justice Coalition and as well as NUMSA have argued for social ownership of renewable energy, which I think also speaks to the idea of the forms, or which speaks to their ideas of the forms of public ownership these groups are looking to. Do the speakers, and I think Comrade Sandra, you've sort of answered me already, but do you think that ESKOM, led by the state we have, can and should play a role in the transition to renewable energy, and that this can involve community ownership? And so your ideas around a partnership between local government and ESKOM, I think speaks to that. Comrade Lucian, maybe if you could come in, if you think that that might be a good plan or a good proposal for rebuilding these organizations as well. And then also I'd like to ask Comrade Lucian, is there no benefit whatsoever for state ownership of ESKOM with the state we have now, which I think we all agree sucks, as opposed to IPPs? Do you think that they're just exactly the same, or we have to consider, I know you said like we have to consider what's actually going to benefit working class people. Do you, based on what the information you have, think that there's any difference as it stands? Thank you.
Thanks, Veron. I'm going to take now, we've now got quite a number of hands, and I'm asking people just to be as direct as in terms of your question or your comment. We'll take all of you, and then we'll give Lucian and Sandra a chance to respond. Sean, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I tend to agree with Lucian. What's missed in this is that something like ESKOM and the state are intertwined in capitalism. They're not two separate things, they're actually one. And ESKOM for me is a prime example. So whether you look at it now and how contracts are used in terms of supporting companies that are supplying coal, and then actually buying coal at inflated prices and then redirecting that and selling cheap electricity to mining companies. That has always been kind of ESKOM's role. Didn't matter whether it was under apartheid, didn't matter whether it was now. It takes a different form, yes, it takes neoliberalism now. It took a different form under apartheid. I kind of hear what the comrade is saying, you know, maybe decentralization, breaking up things, having a local thing might help. I'm not too sure. My question is more kind of, you could say anything of ownership of ESKOM. You could say, it should be owned under anarchist syndicalist unions, it should be state or whatever. That to me at this point seems too, they're important debates, but we're not there. We're nowhere near that. So for me, the question is, how do you win those local struggles? Comrades were speaking earlier on about, there's definitely a need to rebuild. The working classes definitely in a fragmented state. But what are some of the things that you can win locally that maybe, what are the things that communities can mobilize locally that you can eventually build on? So what would some victory at a local level be that increases the working class power? Maybe not at a national stage at this point, but what would some of those victories be? Whether it's demand from ESKOM that is owned by the state or an RPP. I think, to me, it's more important to build on those victories, and that's the only way you're going to change society. At the moment, we don't have the power to change what ESKOM does. So what are the stepping stones that you can win in more immediate struggles, and what do comrades think goes on? How do you go about that?
Okay. I've noted now, Warren, if you still want to speak, let me know. Please raise your hand. I see you've taken it down, but let's Tokologo. I'm going to allow you to speak. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Maybe I should give a background of who I am a bit so that my questions do make sense. My name is Tukulo Ngwasheng, and I'm a Regional Executive Committee member of the ANC in Johannesburg. The first question is, from the history of ESKOM, as the first speaker was telling us, that it was in fact an amalgamation of small other entities. I just want to, from the speaker's point of view, what made maybe the state at the time to actually take the power utility away from the independent power producers? Yeah, that is my first question. And the second question is, we in Johannesburg are probably going to take a route of producing our own electricity particularly given the current relaxation in terms of the legislature. And so we are going to start developing our own power stations and all those things. So my question to both presenters is, what should be the approach so that we don't fall into the same trap, that maybe the city power does not fall into the same trap that ESKOM finds itself in? Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Laura, for those, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for those questions. There are important questions. I'm going to now ask Daniel to ask his question or make his comment. Thanks. Go ahead, Daniel.
Thanks, Dale. So this is mostly directed towards Lucian, and it builds on Sean's and the most recent speaker's comments. Currently, the way of engagement you propose seems still to be engaging in a way that centers the state. So I was wondering if a more direct action approach, which doesn't actually rely on appropriating ESKOM's power, might be better. So focused on supporting relatively organized movements who want to develop their own relatively green, relatively democratic electricity infrastructure, which would become public in the very real sense that was spoken about, and which in turn could become an example that is taken up by people who see the value of these approaches. I understand that startup costs around this are potentially intense, but that seems to me to be a kind of a model that can be taken up in building autonomous power that's separate from state appropriation. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Okay, I'm going to take the last two hands, Warren and Laura. So Warren, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Dale. Thanks, everyone. I'm Warren McGregor from the Global Labour University at Wits University in Johannesburg, and thanks very much for great presentations from Sandra and Lucian. I think I'm basically covered. I think I share Sean's skepticism to an extent, and I am very interested in answers to Daniel's question as well. But then just to also relay, based on the skepticism, number one, how can trade unions and community organizations that want to engage in this not fall into the trap of co-managing a problem that already exists? Not just a capitalist problem, but the obvious problem that we're facing here in South Africa as regards energy. And then also, based on the current structure of the energy sector in South Africa, in particular, the development of and the provision of electricity in South Africa, what are the availabilities for more working class controlled and community-based options? And I think this is essentially what kind of links to Daniel's question, I guess, but basically covered. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. And finally, Laura, go ahead with your question or comment.
Hello, everybody. Just a comment. I'd like to actually agree with Comrade Lucian there and Daniel, as well as Warren, about not trusting the state in, having part of control over the energy. And also to remind comrades that even if it's renewable energy, it is also controlled by the capitalists eventually. It's become big business, whether you're looking at solar panels and this and that. As long as it's in the hands of the state, we know they're serving capital. And just some positives that, there is the ability for local communities to, do some direct action and get some control over their own lives. I watched a movie. I'd actually like to share that with comrades. I'll get a hold of it on the Zapatistas. And the entire narrative was about them getting energy and electricity to their little area where the state refused them for many years. And eventually they managed to set up the entire system, even with a big generator. And something locally in the community of Durban Deep, where Footnote Bombs has been working for many years, they've gone without electricity and water for more than a decade now. And a small area there, just outside Durban Deep, the community got together and we raised funds, and they bought a really big generator, which at the moment is shared amongst, I'd say, about 50 families down the street. And they do it, it supplies the basics like refrigerators and things that our donations have gone out to them, and they do it via periods. So it's very controlled so that the families who need it will have it at a certain period and they'll do it. But it's not a big thing, but it has become possible in these areas where the state has just forgotten about people. We may have, load shedding for a few hours at a time, but there's entire communities where it's been decades and they've got, no basic services. But the route of, going via the state, that's all that corruption, and everything's going to get tied up in the same old issue. And the best we can hope for is to work with our little communities at the time to see if we can get some control over, energy resources into our lives, which is very important. Just a comment from personal experience as well with that direct action that Daniel was talking about. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura, and thank you to all of you who have asked some very, very important questions and made some really interesting comments. I know it's going to be very difficult for Sandra and Lucian to try to respond to everything, and we are approaching the time frame. So I'm going to give each of you, I know it's difficult, but 5 minutes, please, to try to wrap up some of these questions. If you can't answer everything, don't try, but some of the key things that you think. Sandra, Lucian, who would like to take it first, and then we'll come back and wrap things up. Sandra, go ahead.
Okay, so I mean, just to start off with a question about why the kind of independent power producers joined up in the early years or were brought together, and I think that was partly because it was in capital's interests to have a power utility that could provide cheap electricity, and so that was much better, that they could do that if they consolidated the small power stations. It was going to be much more efficient, but fundamentally also it was about the need for a national grid. And a national grid is by nature a monopoly. You can't have different sort of national grids running parallel to each other. So it's a kind of a natural monopoly. So if you're going to have a national grid, you need to have a kind of a national utility to manage that. So I think those are some of it was definitely done in the interests of being able to ensure a cheap source of electricity for the growing minerals energy complex. And that was the kind of core of why ESKOM was consolidated into ESKOM. I think just to sort of my own thinking around these issues is that I think it's important to kind of make space for local initiatives and local possibilities, but I don't think that on its own is going to provide enough power to kind of run the economy. And so, we either have two systems of sort of something that powers the national economy and something that's kind of done at a local level, or we have to find a way of bringing those into one coherent system. So for me, something like ESKOM, which can play ESKOM in partnership, I would argue, with local government, can play a key role in ensuring that it should, that's what the role of a developmental state of the state should be, to ensure that no community, and we know we don't have that state, but I think it's something that we have to fight for and we have to struggle for, is to build a state that is going to ensure that no community is left out without the resources, without the capacity. And I think we have to always build in our thinking and the kind of what I would envisage as a kind of a ESKOM local government community partnership situation, We have to build in the need, the imperative to address the climate crisis, and to be looking at how we do that by introducing renewable energy. Renewable energy, if we're going to have renewable energy becoming a major part of the grid, we're going to have to move from the current grid that we've got to a smart grid, because, you know, with renewable energy, you're adding it in from all over. And sometimes people are drawing from the grid, and sometimes they're contributing to the grid. So there's a lot more complexity to a grid than there is with just sort of a unidirectional flow of electricity. So there's going to need to be huge investment, huge development of a grid like that. And I don't see any other way of doing it except through the state. If we allow a situation where through ESKOM, if we allow a situation where the transmission company is given that responsibility to kind of manage the grid, you know, then the private sector will continue with their independent providers. They sell electricity to the grid. They make, you know, they're making their nice profit. They're benefiting from this, and the state obviously doesn't then get the you know, well, no, the state has to buy the electricity from the generators. So the state is not generating any kind of income from electricity with which they can kind of contribute to ensuring electricity, you know, for all. You know, knowing that there's problems, we're knowing that we're facing a state that is not doing that. But that is part of the struggle of what we have to fight, is a state that is going to meet those needs.
Thanks very much, Sandra. Lucian, handing over to you.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to get a camera on. I've just shifted devices and it doesn't seem to be able to find a camera. I'll fiddle with the settings as we go. But look, I think all of these points are very important, and I'm always reluctant to kind of come out with a simple slogan and, you know, aim at some sort of, you know, I don't like that mode where we sort of act like a sort of a historical reenactment society, that if something was good, then it must always be good. I think flexibility is key and context is key. That said, I do think Sandra raises some very important points. I think obviously one of the problems, if you, in a society like this, if you have a complete decentralization of, say, electricity supply, as Tokoloho says, you could have a municipal power station in Johannesburg, which you used to have. I mean, if you look at the top of Soweto, at the old towers, there was a station there. There was another one in Newtown. That whole Newtown complex it used to be a power station. The turbine hall in Newtown was literally where the turbines were. But in a highly unequal society, that can also equally mean that the big cities, and in the big cities, the wealthy areas get decent power, and a smaller town like where I live, Makanda, formerly Grahamstown, is not going to get anything at all. It simply doesn't have the revenue base. So I think that is a real challenge. And when we talk about decentralization, we also have to think about how you can have from that a sort of an upward coordination as well, because otherwise you can have, you know, these islands in the middle of things. I mean, I think Sandra's point that you need to have some mechanisms to ensure equity and some degree of redistribution are absolutely essential. Whether the state can provide that, I think, is a slightly separate issue. And this goes to the point that Ferran also made. Look, I would say, Ferran, that I first of all, I think a distinction under neoliberalism between state provision and private provision breaks down considerably. You know, when you get this new public management, profit-based state corporations, it starts to blur what we would often think of as the distinction between the right and proper role of the state and the right and proper nature of the private sector. Simple example, when Telkom was partially privatized in 1997, the main foreign investor was actually the state-run telecommunications company of Malaysia. Similarly, a lot of China's companies are state-run, but they're commercial. And because people have this fetish for the state, they assume, well, China is, you know, somehow how socialism and Chinese characteristics. In fact, China represents a more extreme form of a larger trend in which states are acting as capitalists directly. They're not simply working with capitalists, but a basic capitalist logic operates within the states. We could think of the Public Investment Corporation, for example, as Africa's biggest sovereign wealth fund, and it's got investments in absolutely everything, including Lonmin. I mean, my mom was a teacher, her pension's in the government, so sitting in the PIC, so I guess technically she owns Lonmin, it owns Edgar's, and so on and so on. So I think the distinction breaks down a lot. Maybe in an earlier period where there was a much sharper distinction between a non-profit yet still hierarchical state system or sector and a crude or private one may be the thing. But I think in the neoliberal context, the distinction becomes a bit moot. What does social ownership mean? What could a victory mean? That goes partly to Ferran and to Sean. I think it's tricky. I think that a lot, we need to always think about winnable victories. I mean, I think too much of the left project has become bogged down in slogans, whether it's Kasatu wishing the RDP would come back somehow and just beating that dead horse, or whether on the further left we have this or that slogan which comes up absolutely no matter what the situation is. I don't think it's helpful. We need to find things that are winnable because the confidence of the working class is low. It doesn't mean the working class is defeated, but it's retreating and it's fragmenting. So I think I would be a bit reluctant to like hand out, well, here's the plan of action. But I do think some local victories would need to happen. I think the independence from the state, it's a point raised by Daniel and Lara, is absolutely crucial. The state doesn't simply govern society in a simple way on behalf of capital. It's within society. It extends into society and engineers society, whether it's through patronage, whether it's through cooptation into its structures. So I think the autonomy is very important in ensuring that popular movements retain a different character to the state. Instead of the top-down hierarchical logic, they have a bottom-up popular democratic logic. Now, the last 2 points, Tokologo raised the thing about what happened to municipalities and what can Joburg learn. I think that's been covered mostly by Sandra. The one thing I would just add there is the characteristic form of South African capitalism is a highly centralized, concentrated form. Whether you look in the private sector with a classic analysis of white monopoly capital, we had 4 giant companies dominating the Joburg Stock Exchange in the 80s. But actually that exact same pattern exists in the state. So South Africa has pretty much almost never had a privately run train sector. It's had a giant state company, which has now been state department, which has now been restructured as Transnet. And that logic, partly as Sandra said, because it's efficient and it's able to capture resources, is right throughout the state. So this monopolistic structure of monopoly capital, if we want to use that term, is not simply something in the private sector, it's in the state as well. Duncan Innes, in a really important but neglected article in the 80s on monopoly capitalism in South Africa, he counted the 10 biggest units of capital, as he put them in South Africa, and 4 out of the 10 were state corporations. And only if you combine De Beers and Anglo-American were they bigger than what was then Transnet. So I think the destruction of the municipal power stations wasn't simply about efficiency, but it's also about a deeper logic in South African capitalism of capturing resources through setting up monopolies. Okay, Daniel, Lara, I do think these DIY things are important, but I would say there's 2 things. I think it's important that people take initiatives. I think it's incredibly, I hate the whole thing of delivery by the state and the way it disempowers people and turns them into sort of consumers and you know, it's part of the neoliberal thing of breaking people into fragments and then demoralizing them and then trapping them in social media and consumerism, even if it's a consumerism from afar, looking at whoever it is on TikTok. I think those things are important, but I do think it's the big problem is that the key means of production are held by the state and capital, and we need to find ways to extend popular power over those. You know, is it possible to do that? I think putting pressure on ESKOM through a big campaign is one way of doing it. Are there other ways? Probably. But, you know, the Zapatistas, very important what they did, but they were very strong. And they were also in a sector where the state wasn't that interested in that part of the country. It's not a situation that can easily be reproduced elsewhere, you know. So I'm fully in favor of self-activity, people building respect between themselves, in pride in their neighborhood, making solutions. But I think we have to keep pressure on the ruling class that controls and owns most of the resources. And I think that's not incompatible with direct action. I think it's a question of putting pressure onto them, just as you put pressure on a big company to pay higher wages, or try to stop some disinvestment or whatever. We can do similar things with ESKOM. I'll stop there. I apologize for not having a video. I changed devices, but I'll just leave it there. Thank you everyone for all your valuable questions. Thank you, Dale, and MZ for hosting this, and thank you, Sandra, for your presentation. I think that was just wonderful, and I think it's really eye-opening. Leave it there.
Thank you. Thanks, Lucian, Sandra. We're now we've just gone a bit over time, and that's great. It was really some really good questions and discussion. Thank you all. We've obviously, as we always do, we've lost quite a few people over the last half an hour, but that's fine. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to hand over Comrade MZ, who was our original moderator, who unfortunately got cut off as a result of communication. I'm just going to give Comrade MZ the last word to bid farewell and say goodbye to everyone. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Comrade Dale. Let me extend my word of thanks to our panelists, Comrade Sandra and Comrade Lucien. Comrades, those were very insightful inputs. Thank you very much. And I also extend my word of thanks to all the participants who participated in debate and raising very incitement or very important questions and comments to the topic. I will say thank you very much, comrades, all of us. Goodbye. Have a nice journey if you are not to go. Thanks very much, comrades. Comrade Dale?
Yeah, that's it. All of you who provided your emails, many of you have left. You will get an email within the next day with a downloading link to this full recording of this webinar. We did stream it live on Facebook as well. Again, thanks to everybody. Go well, go safe, and go strong. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sure. Bye.